Hello, everyone, and welcome to this NLA webinar. I'm Barbara Chesi, Program Director here at NLA, and today we're going to hear about healthy buildings, a focus on light and indoor air quality. In the past year, we have all experienced a dramatic shift in what we as individuals and as a society expect from our buildings. As we spend most of our time indoor, we have become more aware of issues such as indoor air quality and access to light, and more generally, how the quality of our indoor space affects our well-being. And now, as we are gradually starting to come back to offices, public buildings, cultural buildings, and so on, the well-being agenda is critical more than ever. I'm really pleased today to be joined by some great speakers who will present case studies and research about lights and indoor air quality and how these elements contribute to healthy buildings. This event is part of our year-round well-being program, and I'd like to thank our program champions Airflow and Argent Relator for their support. Before we start, just a reminder to our audience that there will be a chance to ask questions to our speakers later on. So if you have any questions, just post them through the Q&A function and we will get to that at the end. And now I would like to introduce our first speaker, Ian Palmer, Head of UK Specification at Airflow, who will be talking about improving indoor air quality. Ian, over to you.
Thanks, Barbara. As Barbara's mentioned, I'm Head of UK Specification at Airflow Developments. We are a leading UK supplier of ventilation solutions. We also have subsidiaries over in Germany and the Czech Republic. Airflow work in all different sectors across the UK, including the residential, commercial and industrial. On the residential side, that could be new build, that could be retrofit. We also work on in the social housing sector. And on commercial, it could be anything from offices, educational buildings, schools and colleges, up to leisure and retail, and healthcare buildings as well, hospitals and care homes. So Airflow's mission is to, of course, improve indoor air quality. And as Barbara mentioned in the introduction, yes, we're spending more and more time indoors, particularly during the pandemic, where everybody has been stuck at home, if you like. So yeah, that fact there of 90% of our time is spent indoors, you could probably say over the past sort of 12 to 14 months, that's probably increased even further. And yeah, it's not just at home. Obviously, you go from home, you go to work, you're in an office or finished for the day, you're off to the gym or you're off to a restaurant or pub in the evening. It's all time spent indoors. So it's crucial that the indoor air quality is talked about and is thought about when designing these buildings or even having any refurbishment work done to these buildings. Because yeah, you know, opening windows, okay, it's a form of natural ventilation. Lots of people do it in the summer, of course, when it's a lot warmer. But in the winter, you know, you tend to have those windows shut 24/7 because you don't want to let any heat out. And then the other problem with just opening your windows is that if it's polluted outside, you're just letting the polluted air into the building. So one of the best ways to ventilate a building is mechanically. Just going on to talk about the state of Britain's air, because poor indoor air quality, it does affect our health, does affect the economy. Air pollution inside the home can be up to 650 times worse than the outdoor air, particularly, as I mentioned, you know, in the bigger cities like London. You are just bringing in outdoor polluted air. So we really need to make sure that air that's brought in is filtered and filtered to a high standard. So as I go through the presentation here, I'm just going to talk about some filtration methods that can be used to help reduce the pollutants going into the building. So yeah, 15.3 million homes in the UK are at risk of toxic home syndrome. And this is from the buildup of pollutants within the air. And an estimated £600 million in NHS treatment and care as we reduce the productivity and days lost through sickness. So, you know, the indoor air quality does have a massive effect on our health and well-being, and concentration levels. So, you know, when we're at work, if the pollutants are rising throughout the day, you will feel a bit drowsier in the afternoon and not so with it, if you like, and then that's where the fresh air comes in. You know, as soon as you're hit by that fresh air, suddenly you feel a bit more awake again, and that's just from the buildup of pollutants in the atmosphere. So yeah, lack of ventilation, it causes toxic air, and yeah, it's not just in the homes, but in lots of modern buildings now. They're all very, very well insulated, and you're kind of in a bubble as soon as you go into these buildings. There's very, very little air going in or out, hence why we need a form of ventilation in place to be able to control the levels of indoor air quality. Some homes and some buildings now are aiming to achieve passive house standard, which means it's even more airtight. And I'll go on to talk about the passive house standard in a bit more detail in a second as well. But again, because it's airtight, you need to have a mechanical ventilation system in place to ensure you've got the right levels of ventilation running through the building. Yeah, other things that will happen with poor indoor air quality, not enough ventilation. You've got a buildup of dust, and these are contributors to asthma. The fabrics and the furnishings, they release VOCs, and then in the wet room areas where you've got your bathrooms, kitchens, then there's a risk of a damp and mold buildup. And I'm sure we all see and hear about these issues, and there has been a few reports recently on the news, BBC, ITV, talking about the poor state of some of these homes. And it is, the main cause is down to poor ventilation, especially in the wet rooms. That is a core area where you get the mold buildup, where it all starts, because you've got so much moisture in the air. If you're not controlling that moisture, if you're not opening the windows, if you're not extracting that air, then there is going to be a buildup of mold. So the solution, yeah, as I mentioned, bring in fresh air, but then filter that air from outside before you bring that into the building. And just a bit of detail on the passive house standards. So passive house is all down to how well insulated the building is. So as I mentioned, there's a greater air tightness, so there's a greater need for mechanical ventilation. And actually, to achieve a passive house standard, the building has to have a form of mechanical ventilation with heat recovery in place. And then that heat recovery system, or MVHR system, as we abbreviate it to, that has to also comply with its own standards. So the unit itself has to be passive house accredited to be used in these types of buildings. And the advantage, there's lots of advantages with an MVHR system. You have got supply and extract, so you've got supplied filtered fresh air coming into the building and extracting from the wet rooms, extracting stale polluted air out into the atmosphere. But at the same time, the unit itself, the ventilation unit itself, is recovering the heat. So in the winter time, it's not just sucking out all your hot air and chucking it out into the atmosphere. It is actually saving that heat energy. And nowadays, heat recovery systems can achieve heat recovery efficiencies up towards 95%. So you're losing very, very little heat. So you're saving energy. That heat is then transferred across the supply air, which is brought back into the room or into the building. And that means, you're able to turn your thermostats down, you can turn your heating down, and save on your energy bills, save on your heating bills. So the heat recovery system, yes, we talk about it a lot, but it is one of the best forms of ventilation available to us. And with the building regulations currently being updated and released, there is more and more of a push towards this type of ventilation system in all new buildings, not just residential but commercial as well. So ensuring thermal comfort. So the MVHR systems, they include features to minimize the risk of overheating in commercial and domestic buildings. Overheating is a topic discussed quite regularly now in the industry, be it residential or commercial. There's always a worry, especially with buildings that are all glass or have too many windows. It's great because you're letting in all the light and everything, but it does, of course, have a high heat gain. So that we're always looking for solutions on how to reduce that heat in the building. And all people think when you hear the term heat recovery, oh well, it's actually it's a unit heating up the building. Correct, it is heating up. It does heat the building up in the winter time, but actually what gets forgotten about is that these MVHR systems, they actually have an automatic 100% summer bypass facility in place. And this is standard across all MVHR units. It's been driven by the building regulations and ERP eco design, that all MVHR systems must have a summer bypass in place. And this means that in the summertime, when the unit reaches a certain temperature, the bypass damper kicks into place, and it ensures that the fresh air doesn't cross over the heat exchanger in the summertime. So it's not recovering your heat in the summertime. And then when you're drawing that air from outside, and then that crosses over with the air inside, there is a slight cooling effect. So we call it, even in the night times, you can get nighttime cooling, but we call it a free cooling effect. And this is before you even add any additional air conditioning to the system. So you can also, with these MVHR systems, there is options to add cooling coils, either integral to the ventilation unit itself or separately throughout the building. But one common misconception that I hear quite a lot is that people that haven't necessarily come across ventilation or air conditioners as much, or they're not too aware of it, they kind of think of it as the same thing. So we're always often saying, no, air conditioning just cools. It doesn't bring in any fresh air. It doesn't extract any air. Air conditioning just cools or heats up the air that's already in the building. The ventilation system is what brings that fresh air in and extracts that fresh air, extracts the polluted air, sorry. So there's I say there's a new piece of technology called bipolar ionization, although the fact is it has been out for some time. Airflow use this ourselves in our facilities at head office, and the way the system works, it's another piece of technology which you can add on to the overall ventilation system on the supply side going into the building. So it's on top of the filtration it's on top of the filtration levels that are already in place. So in a lot of these in a lot of these buildings, you've got your standard filtration on the unit itself, an extract filter, a supply filter, and then this bipolar ionization, or ion generators, we can call it. I'm just putting up. They clean the air of pollutants. They safeguard against viruses and bacteria to improve the overall indoor air quality. So these ion generators, they can be used to destroy the airborne contaminants in your home. And just to briefly explain how it works, they introduce millions of positively and negatively charged oxygen ions into the air. They attach themselves to the airborne contaminants to neutralize harmful gases and aerosols, and then they destroy the bacteria and viruses and break down VOCs as well. So the resulting non-viable detritus, if that's a word, is clustered together with other airborne particles to ensure they get captured by filters and removed from the air. So bipolar ionization is completely natural, chemical-free process and will not have any negative impact on the air that you breathe. So yeah, I say it's a new piece of technology. As you can tell, I'm still learning it myself, but it's something that will help us combat against viruses such as the coronavirus. Other methods used are filters such as UVC, which are maybe a bit more commonly known. But these bipolar ionization generators seem to be the way forward to help us clean that air to that extra level. So yeah, there's a couple of key points here: up to 95% of bacteria and virus reductions, and it does outperform UV and HEPA filters. Just going on to CO2. So the ventilation systems, they can all work with CO2 sensors. I'm sure lots of us have heard the term demand control ventilation. So CO2 sensors in place with ventilation systems will help the ventilation adjust throughout the day, so it's only ever providing the right amount of ventilation for the space. I was just looking over my CO2 sensor in my room at the moment, and it's just saying the CO2 levels were around about 400 parts per million, which is a good level. It's not too high, but that's just with me in the room. So you can imagine in a full room, those CO2 levels start to increase, and they do increase quite dramatically, especially, you know, if we're in an office, we're going into the boardroom, we're all packed into there, the CO2 sensors will go through the roof. So it's important that when those CO2 levels rise, that you increase the ventilation into the space to extract the pollutants and to bring in that fresh filtered air. And again, the CO2 levels do have a detrimental effect on the concentration and productivity levels. So again, even in the workplace, it's very important that we get these CO2 levels correct and get them to a good level throughout the day. There is guidelines, CIBSE guidelines, of course, that dictate what the levels should be and what they shouldn't exceed on commercial buildings and domestic as well. And the filter systems that are in place as standard, we have G4 filters, we have M5 filters, and we have F7 filters. This is the old grade that they were known as. The new grades are slightly different, as you see there. An F7 filter is now known as an EPM1 filter, which is part of the new ISO standard 16890. And that's the same as well, of course, with the G4 and M5 filters. The G4 is now known as ISO coarse 75%, and the M5 filters are now known as EPM10 50%. It's all relevant to the particles that they stop from coming into the building. And just to finish up, I'd mentioned earlier in the slide, but airflow, we of course have our own systems up and running in our Air Academy. So it's welcome to anyone to visit. We often work with a lot of key designers that like to come and see the products firsthand and witness how they're working. The facility we also use for training, for NIC, EIC training for approved installers, and we hold CPDs there as well. So it's a very nice facility to have, full of our products, and we use it mainly to train people on indoor air quality. So thanks very much for your time, and I look forward to the questions at the end.
Thank you, Ian. That was very, very interesting. And now on to our second speaker, Soo-Hong Seng, Associate at Hawkins Brown, who will be talking about light. Soo-Hong, over to you.
Good morning. So my name is Soo-Hong and I'm an associate at Hawkins Brown Architects. We work across a wide range of sectors and we have offices based in London, Manchester, Edinburgh and Los Angeles. So research is a really important part of what we do. It's embedded within our studio, trying to help us improve how we design as well as to inform and generate debate. So today I'll be speaking about a research project that I carried out focusing on light and well-being. Let me try to get the slides to move. There we go. So approaches to light. We skip on. The relationship between architecture and health has been explored throughout history for architects, ranging from the ambitions of post-war housing developments and garden cities to sanatoriums and healthcare buildings. And I think I have the same statistic as Ian's slide, which talks about how we spend at least 90% of our time inside buildings. So of course, the design of the built environment has a huge impact on our health and well-being. The UK Green Building Council reported that natural light is the most desired feature that employees want in their workplace. And of course, we know that light can affect multiple aspects of our health, including our sleep cycles, immune system, energy levels, and even our appetite. So as architects, we are faced with lots of challenges of dense urban environments, project briefs that require deep planned buildings, as well as an array of new human-centric electric lighting systems that are being marketed to us. So the research project I set out to do asks the question, how can we creatively approach the design of light in buildings to have a positive influence on occupant well-being? And this was carried out through interviews with experts across different disciplines, creative analysis of standards, as well as real-life light tracking studies and digital modeling analysis. And from all of this, I have developed 3 key design approaches to light, and I'll just briefly talk through these ideas this morning. So the first one is focusing on connecting with nature. The concept of biophilia refers to our innate attraction to nature and natural processes. And of course, it's not a new phenomenon, but more recent studies have shown convincing evidence that link interactions with nature with increased productivity, reduced absence in workplaces, increased concentration and learning in schools, and reduced recovery times in healthcare. So the design of natural and artificial lighting in buildings plays a really key role in making us feel closer to the natural world. In my interview with Oliver Heath, an architect who's an expert in biophilic design, he speaks about biophilia as a human-centered and holistic approach that considers the whole journey of a person throughout the day and throughout the building, and the different places where people might interact. Nature is also a source of inspiration. So this was in the design of electric lights by the lighting design studio Haberdashery in my conversation with their creative director, Ben Rigby, He spoke about their focus on drawing from nature to trigger personal memories and to encourage people to develop an emotional connection to light, which is a really interesting way to approach it. So I think it's important to recognize that biophilia is more than just about adding water features or providing a view of plants in buildings. So by investigating biophilic design patterns, I propose that we take a biophilic design approach to light and incorporate 4 of these key features. So the first one on the left there looks at dynamic light, referring to subtle changes and non-rhythmic sensory patterns that occur in nature, and aims to create visual interest and a sense of calm. This could be achieved through integration of planting around a glazed building to create dappled natural light and shadow inside the building, or by adding reflective surfaces and features into an atrium space. Mystery uses light and shadow to create a space that is slowly revealed, compelling you to move forward and invoking a sense of anticipation and discovery that we typically associate with more natural environments. I think designers can use light to create mystery conditions in buildings, going from a relatively darker space and partially revealing a brighter space ahead, or using obscured sources for both natural and artificial lighting. And then the third one looks at the savanna-like environments, which offer expansive open views over a distance. So these provide a greater sense of awareness and control. I think we all remember like the feeling of being on top of a hill and being able to see everything around you, and having exposure to daily and seasonal patterns of changing colors and brightness of daylight is important to help heighten our awareness. This can be achieved in buildings by introducing light to the space through apertures that follow the path of the sun, capturing the changing light from morning to night. And finally, refuge, referring to an environment that can provide a sense of security and protected setting to support restoration. Light levels in refuge spaces differ from their adjacent spaces, with a lower light level and perhaps a different color temperature. And then the second design response is focused on designing light qualities for different activities and moods. The Finnish architect Plasma writes that architecture should not specify emotion, but should invite emotion. So as we design the spatial layout, volume, and furniture of spaces to suit a variety of activities, moods, and emotions, light is an important factor that supports this, which in turn supports our health and well-being. Oh, let me just go back. So as part of the research, I was inspired by the light artist Liz West, who I interviewed, and she spoke about the ways that she tries to provoke heightened sensory awareness in the viewer and emphasize that we all have different taste and perceptions of light and color, and that's something really important to acknowledge. At a practical level, we need appropriate lighting for the tasks that are performed in a space, but we need to remember that preferences for color, brightness, or contrast are personal and variable. To help us further develop our understanding of the quantitative measurements of light and color temperature, myself and my colleague Michael wore a light sensor. So it was like a small pin that you could pin to your shirt or the collar. And this was for 1 week in December, pre-pandemic, in the office. And we kept a log of our movements in the office, and as well as the time spent outside during those days. The study investigated how the spatial layout of our studio changed the way we worked and inherently changed the types of light that we experienced. So where we were sitting in the office was very different. Michael had a fixed desk, whereas I was sitting in this new area of our studio that had been set up to be made up of different zones of different types of workspaces for agile working and hot desking, and really to encourage you to move around based on what you're doing. So when we compared the types of light that we experienced, this was just looking at color temperature of light, we found that throughout 3 days, I had a much more varied light experience whilst working at a desk, whereas Michael's experience was mainly around, was very limited actually in terms of color temperature. When he was at his desk, it was always around a 3000 to 4000 Kelvin, which was mainly from the electric light that was above his desk. Whereas in my experience, it was much more varied. This was partly due to the fact that I was moving around and sitting in different locations every day, but also even throughout the day, there was a lot more movement. And I think that relationship between our activity, where we are, and light was something that was really interesting. And then we focused in on also the experience of just 1 day working in this new setup. I think it helped us to assess the lighting conditions in the different spatial zones and align these with the activities. The information that we collated has been really helpful and will inform future improvements that we can make to the lighting and the layouts of the workspace. I think it's important to think about activity-based lighting and activity-based spatial design creatively together, so that they work together to really support agile ways of working. And this is something that we're thinking about as we plan our return to the office as well. And as an office, we're exploring different ways that light can support different activities, such as socializing, meetings, and also individual focused work. So here, these are just some ideas that we're thinking about, always thinking about not just the space, but the activity, the emotions, and the light conditions that we might want with that. So really thinking holistically. And finally, the third design response is focused on using light to support our biological clock. I think most of us have probably heard the terms circadian rhythm or circadian lighting been used a lot in the industry in recent years. There has been a lot of focus on the influence of light on the hormone melatonin and how this affects our sleep. But what was really fascinating was that it's actually about so much more than just sleep. So just a brief explanation about circadian rhythms. It refers to the daily fluctuations in our biology. There's a master clock in our brain that coordinates the biological clocks in our body and keeps them all in sync. So circadian rhythms can affect, they affect body temperature, blood pressure, hormones that regulate mood, and even our body's response to food. And the link with light is that our eyes have photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, which receive light and send signals to our brain's master clock. And then these cells are also particularly sensitive to light in the blue spectrum, which is why there's been a lot of discussions about blue light in relation to sleep as well. In the industry, there have been a multitude of LED lighting systems that carry out automated changes in color temperature and illumination levels throughout the day. These systems are described as circadian or human-centric. And I think the developments in this field are exciting, particularly for healthcare and shift workers who rely a lot on electric lighting. But there is ongoing debate about their effectiveness and how much they actually influence our circadian rhythm. So I think as architects, we should stay informed, but also not become overly reliant on these systems. One common message that I found from scientific research and also new lighting standards about circadian lighting is about a need to prioritize bright morning light. For example, in the WELL building standard, there's a minimum recommendation for light levels between 9 a.m. and 1 p.m., which is based on the research that the importance of bright morning light to aligning the circadian rhythm with the day-night cycle. So what the research has found is that by having this burst of morning light in the morning, I think they don't quite know how much, how bright, for how long, but that everyone can agree that it is a really important part of setting and keeping us in sync with our circadian rhythm and the day-night kind of cycle around us. So with this in mind, I carried out, I spent a day at one of our projects, the Urban Sciences building up in Newcastle, which has a kind of southeast facing glazed atrium space with a lot of collaboration spaces and cafe and shared spaces around this atrium. And what was really interesting was to study how the orientation and the design of the atrium and its surrounding collaboration spaces can support our need for morning light. So by providing all the communal spaces facing onto this atrium, it allowed all the occupants of the building to have access to bright natural light in the morning, no matter where they were kind of based in the building. And then I won't go too much into this, but just a bit of information about the Well Building Standards new metric for circadian lighting. So that's a new metric that's been introduced called equivalent melanopic lux, which compared to the usual lux levels, photopic lux levels that we're used to, EML takes into account directionality. So it's looking at what kind of light we receive on the vertical plane at eye level. And that can have an impact, I think, on the directionality of kind of the design of desk and furniture layouts. And it also applies a ratio called melanopic ratio, which is based on the light source and its correlated color spectrum. So it's a metric that tries to link the two metrics of both brightness and also color spectrum into one. So along with Elementa Consulting engineers we were working with there, we carried out an atrium study, which was trying to help us understand this new metric and to also understand what the architectural implications would be on this metric. So we just looked at a kind of simple atrium typology and kind of different factors that would affect the EML levels of the space. So just briefly, I'll just show some slides to show. So we tested things like what is the effect of the internal wall surface color and the kind of the reflected light that you'll get from that color. And you can see there's really different contrast between the red and the blue wall on its effects on the EML levels of the space. And similarly, we looked at some interventions within the atrium, so adding things like collaboration spaces and landings within the atrium, and looked at the different effects that had on EML levels as well. So by working with the engineer, I think it was a really useful way for us to begin to understand this and really show the importance of collaboration as well. And finally, just to wrap up, during my research, I asked the question, is glare ever a good thing, to Chris Cummings, who was the technical director at Chapman BDSP. And his response was, it's like that saying, there's no such thing as bad weather. There's just the wrong type of clothing or the wrong type of activity. Sunlight is never a bad thing. It's just you can't use your laptop in it, but you can sit there and have a cup of tea. So I think that's just a really great way to think about how we design for light in buildings. And a few key takeaways from today. So I think natural light still comes first despite technological advancements. Use biophilic design to connect us with the outside. Give occupants variety, choice, and a sense of control. Prioritize bright morning light and allow for dimmed warm light in the evenings. Consider internal finishes and colors, and consider how buildings can also be designed to encourage us to spend more time outside, so under natural light, so such as incorporating external courtyards, roof terraces, changing rooms that allow people to cycle into work. So actually just thinking about the routine of a person throughout their whole day rather than just what they're doing when they're in your building. And I think that's everything from me. It was a bit speedy at the end, but yeah, there's some further reading there of kind of research from Hawkins Brown, but also some of the key kind of articles and books I found interesting as part of the project. And that's everything from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Soo-Hong. That was absolutely interesting. And now let's go into our last presentation. And I'm glad to introduce Phil Coffey, Director at Coffey Architects. Phil, over to you.
Hang on a minute. Sorry, I have control. Sorry, I've unmuted. Thanks, Soo-Hong. It was really, really interesting. I think I'm going to kind of continue with your conversation, but maybe on the more emotional basis of light. And being a photographer and an architect, I'm going to run through my passion for both. just starting with the blue marble, which is the photograph taken in 1972 from Apollo 17. They landed on the moon, but this is my favorite part of that mission. It's one of the most widely distributed photographs on this planet. And it reminds me of why I'm an architect every day, in the sense that climate change and global warming is the thing that we should all care about these days, and we should all be connected to our environment. And one of the fundamental ways in which we do that as architects is by connecting us through daylight and through the movement and temporal movement of that wonderful star that we are next to. This is a photograph of Ivanpah, which is, as I passed by, I didn't know what it was at the time, but these structures reflect the light and create energy for hundreds of thousands of homes. And it's one of those humbling moments when you recognize your place in the cosmos, and the idea that light is coming from the sun. It takes 8 minutes and 20 seconds to arrive here, and every structure that we make, no matter how big or small, should be taken incredibly seriously, because there's an awful lot of light in the world, but not a lot of shadow. And when we make any piece of architecture, we make something that captures or encloses a piece of that cosmos, a little bit of that light. And if we're connected to that light, then we're connected to our wider world. The opposite of that, of course, is this is from a balcony of my hotel in Las Vegas, is going into a casino where oxygen is pumped in, there's no daylight. In fact, they actively encourage you not to be able to find your way out, to disorientate you, and to ensure that you are not connected to your environment in order that you spend more and more money. And between Ivanpah and Las Vegas sits architecture. So everything that we make has to be considered in a way that we allow light in or don't allow light in terms of aperture, percolation, cleave, and orientation. As I said, I'm a photographer. This is a photograph of midnight in the Antarctic. I just left the bar, which was a beautiful, warm orange light, out into a kind of a blue-gray light. And you'll find that I think most of my Instagram photographs, if they're blue or they're blue and orange, are the most liked. We have this very strong connection to those colors and those times of day, when the golden hour, the blue hour in the morning, golden hour, blue hour in the evening, and the middle of the day, in stark contrast from the polar regions. This is a photograph from Machakos, which is an incredible little church. Just simple holes in the roof, in this tin roof, very simple materials, but such an incredibly dynamic space, incredibly spiritual place to be. One of my favorite places I've ever been. I spent some time, I just wish I'd taken a video of this thing moving as we go through. But in a sense, in this very small room on the equator, connected to the wider world, and thinking about the wider world and how we affect it. This is a photograph from the Arctic. We talked about ionized bipolar. I'm bipolar, which means I've been to the Arctic and the Antarctic. This is it's one thing to talk about here is in terms of Arctic reindeer. They have an entirely different circadian rhythm, as Zhu Hong was talking about, in the sense that they have 6 months daylight, 6 months in the dark, which affects their breeding, the way they eat, and the way they sleep. And that is in stark contrast to human beings. We have a photoperiod circadian rhythm, the sunrise and the sunset, and we're connected to that. And architecture is a way, fundamentally a temporal discipline, which reconnects us to our circadian rhythms. As Zhu Hong says, you can't make accurate or exact examples of how this happens, but it's something that I think is incredibly important in terms of natural daylight and our well-being. So from a kind of a latitude question, there's also kind of small changes in geographical location. I was born in Manchester and grew up in Liverpool. This is a photograph I took on a 4-day project of the Manchester Ship Canal. And as you walk from the industrial interior of Manchester with a zenith light to what you could argue is horizon and wide open skies of Liverpool, the fundamental change in the atmosphere is significantly different. So the light changes along this 25-mile stretch. And my family lived all along this Manchester Ship Canal, and there's something innate about the personality and relationship to people and place that you have, and I attribute that in large extent to the place that ones live and the light that is brought in those places. There's geographical change, but there's also kind of the sunlight in the morning that Zhu Hong was talking about. This is a 3-hour walk up to the Old Man of Store in Skye. I did the walk the day before, but unfortunately it was covered in clouds, so I had to do it again. But it's a wonderful thing getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning to walk in nature and connected to it, and to see that bright sunlight first thing in the morning. It makes you feel connected to the planet and gives you a sense of well-being, and that connection to nature, I think, is an incredibly important part again in architecture. At the other end of Britain, this is a photograph of Potalic tin mine taken only a few weeks ago of geometry in landscape at sunset. So again, this is a golden hour, actually, just before the golden hour, just before the sunset. It's not just anecdotal and just personal. This is one of my favorite buildings, which is a photograph taken a couple of years ago of the Louvre in Abu Dhabi. You exit the Louvre, which is the controlled environment in terms of air conditioning and light control, out into this space, which is orchestrated by Nouvel, well, what he calls the rain of light. He doesn't design the building for what it looks like, he designs for what it creates. And people come out and dance in these pockets of light, all races, all ages, all ethnicities. It's something that brings us all together, and some of my most incredible or fondest memories are in light, as I'm sure many of yours are. And so from Abu Dhabi to some of the projects that we've been doing over the past 15 years, based around light or thoughts about light. We won the Stephen Lawrence Prize in 2012 at St. Patrick's School. One of the questions in the brief was to bring the children in. Teaching children first thing in the morning is very bad for their circadian rhythms. They don't tend to be larks. They should be taught maybe after 11, when they've kind of caught up with the teachers who are a bit older. But in essence, this was a place to calm the children down first thing in the morning, as well as being a library and a music store. This is the light or shadow being cast onto the building from the east through a cherry tree, and then inside that light passes then through green glass, which the kids are then in the morning, where they're brought in for an hour just to calm down before they go in to some of their classes. Green is well known to be connected to nature and has a soothing effect in terms of your well-being. The Science Museum is a completely different take on light, relating back to the Jacquard loom, and this idea of the first computer is the pattern that we came up with. However, the biggest idea around this was the idea of knowledge and the long reading room. There are many long reading rooms of libraries throughout the world, but one of the things about walking down a long reading room is you're moving up and down the space, and the syncopated panels here, one panel against another, allows the light to pass through. And if you go to our website, you see the movie at the beginning, which shows how the light twinkles. And the idea was that as you walk down this space, you get a twinkle of light like you do through trees as you walk through a park. So you get an experience of light which is constantly changing and asks you to look. And really, I guess this is what this is all about, is asking people to look or to observe. And by observing, they're observing the natural world, and by observing the natural world, they're more connected to their natural rhythms, and it affects their well-being. So you can see when the sun comes through, it casts shadow and light onto the opposing wall, and the digital nature of the light that comes through that. It's a shadow which is placed on, it comes through the first layer, then casts shadow onto the second layer, and then that creates shadows and light onto the furthest layer. So it's about creating a treatment or the percolation of light through a thin elevation to make richness, which is observed. This one talks a little bit more about aperture and reflection factor. It's a recently completed project. It's a house which is in Woolacombe, which overlooks Mort Bay and Baggy Point. You can see it's on a quarry, which then there is a ruin which sits above that, and the place that we call the solar within the hipped roof. And we did a number of studies in terms of the equinox and solstices, winter and summer, to see how that captured light, which is something I'm really interested in, 2D and 3D with photography and architecture, the space between the aperture and the skin, or the surface in the skin internally of the building. And we're only at the start of this research, but we're really interested in an architecture that we can make through captured light, not just resultant light. And this is the space that is generated, which is a space which is basically, it comes back to something that Hawke said in The Environmental Imagination about the sense of repose and refuge against the sensibility of the sundial. In essence, a room that is at one domestic and at the other about the wilderness and about the cosmos. And so here you're next to the fireplace, you can cook, you have the stability of the horizon, but you also have the dynamic range of the zenith light and playing the landscape against the portrait. Underneath the solar is the ruin, where we use reflective materials, a different reflection factor to reflect the walls down into the floor to make an ephemeral series of spaces, which then holds the solar above, which is painted in dark, dull grey light paint, in order to make the distinction. So there are several different spaces and relationships to light. You wake up to the quarry, which is a green hue and has caustic light which comes in and is bounced off the quarry and creates a very calming place. So you get the long view and the calming of the quarry at the same time. And finally, as a project, our recently completed 22 Handyside Street, done for the promoters of this particular talk today, Argent, a wonderful client. And this is really just about a flock wallpaper, or what I like to call my modern day light flock wallpaper. This is the elevation facing south, and it's a very bold roof line to give a kind of a light industrial feel, but it isn't a whimsical response to the site. It is directly related to the structural grid that is formed by the 3 tunnels that pass underneath the site, which then offsets the grid, which then leads to the superstructure, which then leads to the layout of the roof. So the roof is actually fundamentally linked, like your hip bone's connected to your knee bone, in the same way that the tunnels are connected to the roof for this project. The plans, as you can see, very simple balconies to the south, the roof, which creates an elevation to York Way and to 22 Handyside Street to the south, and very simple core. This is a view from York Way with a pocket park in front. The elevation, or the thinness of the elevation, it's always a challenge these days. One of the biggest challenges working in a benign environment like Britain is that you can solve issues with comfort cooling. And therefore you lose layering, and an awful lot of non-linear beauty lies in layering or depth. And so what we're trying to do is trying to find depth and beauty in as little depth as possible to make sure that the gross internal area is maximized. There are 3 types of panel. You can see one which is glazed, one which is opaque, which has the panel in front, and the other which has a panel in front of a translucent piece of glass which is inside. As you enter into a dark space. That dark space asks you to look up, and Zhu Hong mentioned this earlier in terms of bright spaces, dark spaces moving to brighter spaces, and you enter up onto the top floor from the dark space into the bright, making interesting roof lights, making interesting forms, making interesting shapes, which again ask you to look, which is a big part of what architecture is. You exit into the top floor, which has the void of the roof externally expressed. On the external terraces facing south, you get this wonderful percolation of light and this identity of the diagonal and the triangle, which is constantly moving against the cleave of the roof form above. It's just an abstract of the corner, showing the panels at dusk, a detail. And then inside, the light strikes across that roof, giving a wonderful sense of place as the light travels through. This is the internal flock wallpaper I was talking about, which is, you can see here, the external facade is casting a shadow onto the translucent glass behind. So at once, you're making the interior talk to the exterior, which is unusual in an office building. And this light will constantly move throughout the day. You can see the 3-dimensional nature of the panel in that panel on the back side. And you can see the thinness of the elevation and the richness that is reached. It's an early sketch, which is, again, 2 layers, similar to the smaller project of design of the Science Museum, but looking at different ways of capturing light rather than taking it through 2 panels and twinkling. We're taking it through 1 and creating that light wall on the back side. And why do that? Well, when you're in this office and you're sat there and you're doing your work, perhaps as that light moves and you look up and you see that moving slowly over time, you're connected to the sun, you think about the sun, and that brings a sense of well-being to you just by being connected to nature. It also offers a sense of identity through light. On the King's Cross estate, both externally and internally. It's not necessarily a building where you forget quickly in terms of its ideogram. And of course, as the sun sets, you get some wonderful moments as the sun goes down. Just to finish, This is one of my favorite photographs, one of the first ones I took. It's from Myanmar. It's total architecture to me. This gentleman is lying above where we ate dinner the night before. I think we had pig's eyes on that particular occasion, but the sun was coming up, the smoke was coming up. He's dying of respiratory problems, unfortunately, but he's located on the east side of the building, above where the fireplace was, as the sun rises in the east, which is pretty much all you have to think about in architecture, as far as I'm concerned. Oh, and further to Zhu Hong's point, he's wearing the clothes that he needs to wear. It's not necessarily that he's making an environment that's perfect, but he looks after his own comfort in the way that he knows how to. Just as a final point, we've been really encouraged over the past couple of months. Our websites and our conversations are all around light and about well-being, and I'm doing a PhD on circadian rhythms as we speak. And on a simple level, on a marketing level, people are now coming to us and talking to us about being much more engaged in their environment. Having been stuck at home, they've realized that the environment in which they live in, both in terms of light and air that Ian was talking about, are much, much more important to them. And I think this is an incredible opportunity for architects to really grasp hold of the idea of climate change, global warming, connected to light and well-being, which is something that we should all be thinking about much more as we go forward. As a terrible kind of moment at the end, I'm going to plug my philcoffee.com, where you can look at my photographs, coffeelight.com, which is where you can find lots of the books that I've read to support my PhD, one of them being Chasing the Sun, which Zhu Hong put up earlier, coffeehomes.com and coffeearchitects.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you for sharing all those amazing pictures. We're now running slightly late, but we're going to have a little bit of time for Q&A. So just a reminder for the audience to put any question you have. But before anything, I would like to introduce our new panelist, Graham Harrell, Wicona UK Sales Director at Hydro Building System, who is joining us for this part of the conversation. So Graham, coming to you, after hearing all the presentations today and from your own experience, what are the key considerations from your point of view to take into account when looking at lights and indoor quality in buildings?
Okay, thanks, Barbara, and thanks to everybody for some really, really good presentations that made me write lots of notes. So a building facade is, one extent, it can block out the light completely, or it can let it in completely. And I noticed, listening to Phil and to Zhu Hong, one of our industry's kind of little cliches recently has been talking about flooding a building with natural light, and I think it's clear that just flooding it with natural light is too broad, is too crude, because natural light, as Ian said earlier, actually can actually lead to a heat build-up. It can lead to quite a kind of a samey kind of environment. But what a good facade can do is the sort of thing that Phil was showing, where you can mix opacity, you can mix transparency, and it's not just a static position during the whole day. It moves as the light source moves. It moves with the seasons as well. And the facade shading and transparency setup can be made to actually move itself. It doesn't have to be static. So it can optimize conditions at different times of day for different types of users. And what I see a lot of buildings where the facade is there to keep out the weather, maybe to let in the light, but maybe not much more than that, and maybe not to optimize it. And I think that, well, I know that the technology and the materials are there to do a better job and create a much more healthy environment from a light point of view. Just quickly touching on what Ian was talking about, he is of course absolutely right. I can't make a window that will take a noxious external environment atmosphere and turn it into a clean one inside, and his company is very, very good at doing that. And so I think there's a place for opening elements in a facade and for mechanical ventilation within a building. And we won't get into a lot of detail, but we see an awful lot of emotion and sometimes quite tense behavior in offices and other buildings about who pushes and pulls opening windows. Are they the right type of window? Is it in the right place? Is it too heavy? Is it producing the wrong ventilation effect at the wrong level? And again, with a bit of careful thought, the right type of opening can be put into a facade to complement a mechanical system and achieve maybe some psychological and some very real ventilation effects, but the two things can complement each other. So without going into lots of detail, I think facade has a responsibility for both of these elements, and a good facade, from what I've heard from these experts, can be made to meet those kind of requirements with a bit of thought.
Thanks, Ian. We're almost up to time, but there's a couple of questions, Ian, that perhaps you could address before we close today. One is Ruth is asking that she is involved in the design of a care home, and I've been advised that heat recovery is viable on ventilation from communal spaces, but not on extract fans on the bathrooms. Would you agree? And then there's a second one, question about the filter, whether the system that you use filter out particles from primarily pathogens that cause harm to human health. So if you briefly want to touch on those things.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks, Barbara, and thanks for the questions, guys. Yeah, I just briefly read them earlier as well as they popped up. So yeah, I mean, in answer to the care home question, firstly, the MVHR is a whole house system. So actually, you don't need MVHR and extract fans. You just need MVHR. The extract from the MVHR or to the MVHR is from the wet rooms, so it's from the bathrooms. So the MVHR will extract from those wet rooms, bathrooms, kitchens, and then it will supply to the habitable rooms. So your living rooms, your dining areas. So yeah, MVHR is a full system. So you don't need extract and MVHR. You just need MVHR. In answer to the other question on the filter side, so yeah, the mechanical ventilation systems, or MVHRs, again, they have filtration in the units themselves as standard. They often have a G4, which is an ISO coarse filter, commonly on the extract side, and then they have a higher grade F7 filter or ISO EPM1 filter on the supply side, and that F7 filter is what filters the pollen particles out. The ion generators that I mentioned are an additional option on that system. So as standard, you should, if you're installing an MVHR system, it will have the G4 and F7 filters. And then you've got an option there for these additional technologies like the ion generators or like additional higher grade filters to filter particles out even further. So the ion generators are mainly focused on neutralizing the things like virus cells, but the standard filters will filter all the main pollutants out before they come into the building.
Great, thank you so much, Ian. Unfortunately, this is time is up now for us. Thank you again for all the amazing presentations. We will put the presentation up online so our audience can review them later on if they want to refer to those. And we're also going to have a short poll for our audience to give us a little bit of feedback from today's session, which is always useful for us to know for planning future events. So thank you so much again for amazing presentation, and have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you,
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.